Hey guys, real quick, I just wanted to take a quick second to tell you about the show's awesome sponsor, Anchor. Back in 2019, when I started this podcast, I didn't know much about podcasting at all. Luckily, I came across Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free, it has built-in creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can also be heard on all the major platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started now. Hey everyone, welcome to the 805 Uncensored, a podcast about radical politics, history, music, spirituality, and more. I'm your host, Jordan Barney. This is episode number 42, and tonight on the show, I'll be speaking with three awesome comrades from literally all over the country. Got one of our regulars, Ian Stevens,
Howdy.
And two brand new guests, Sam and Shinji.
Howdy.
How's it?
You guys just want to do a quick introduction of yourself? Maybe just talk about some of your interests and your political background.
Mm-hmm. All right. Want to go first, Shinji?
Sure. So I'm originally from Cuba. I came here when I was like around 7 or 8. I've been a leftist for a pretty long time, probably for 5-6 years now. Mostly interested in Latin America and Cuba. And yeah, that's basically it.
Cool.
How's it? I'm Sam. I live in Hawaii. I was here since I was 3. Only been back to the mainland once or twice to visit family. My interests are in Hawaiian history, radical politics. I was a leftist, Democrat till college. Then I became a Marxist. And then dealing with Marxists, I became an anarchist.
Fuck yeah.
My name's Ian. I am a writer, political scientist. I write a lot about, my specialty, I guess, is foreign policy, but I tend to write a lot more about class politics and economic situations and technology, things like those. And I have a YouTube channel. You can check that out on YouTube. It's called the Lucretia Report, Lucretia.
Great. Thanks, guys. So today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about American imperialism in Cuba and Hawaii, as well as a discussion on the role of the military in a socialist society. So I think first things first, let's go ahead and define what imperialism is. So as per dictionary.com, we've got the policy of extending the rule of authority of an empire or nation over foreign countries for defending political and economic access, power, and control, which is often employed through hard power, especially military force. Imperialism is closely aligned with the concepts of colonialism and empire, which we'll get to in a second, but they're separate concepts nonetheless. So, Sam, you mentioned neocolonialism first, which is the use of economic, political, cultural, or other pressures to control or influence other countries, especially former dependencies. So,
it's not a direct control over the government as regular colonialism. It'd be more control over the economy, over how people live their everyday lives towards what end. Usually the economic end benefits the colonizer or the neocolonizer rather than direct control over the government.
Well said. And then we have free trade imperialism right here, which is by making less developed states by force or treaty embrace free trade policies, creates a dependence of the less developed on the more developed by being unable to compete.
Yeah, and we've done this since the Opium Wars and maybe even before that. Like with China, after Britain forced them open we came in and said, hey, we also want these deals you made with Britain. So we're going to make you take what we call most favored nation status with us, which means, whatever unfair treaties you do with other colonial countries, we want those benefits too. And so by forcing open Japan and all kinds of other countries to free trade, which is just unregulated markets to all around the world, usually the more advanced countries take advantage of the less advanced countries because they can't produce what we could produce. And so they become dependent on the producer nation.
Yeah, it's basically the entire strategy of the United States with Latin America.
Yeah.
That's what they've been doing since way early in the days with the Monroe Doctrine. They've just been basically forcing Latin America to embrace American products and American trade. And that's basically what the entire, the American, I forgot what it's called now, the Organization of American States. That's basically just an American puppet organization to just push free trade on Latin America. So.
Right, and this just leads into the concept of informal empire, which describes the spheres of influence which an empire may develop that translate into a degree of influence over a region or a country, which is not a formal colony in the empire itself, but as a result of the extension of a commercial, strategic, or a military interest of the empire. And these are all just some simple definitions from definitions.net.
Yeah, and this is where... Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. And I would add, Sam, you mentioned that they can't produce what we can produce. And I would say it's not even always about us producing more, because very often the point is that they can produce something, is that there's some resource that we want, but that resource is owned perhaps by a company that's not keeping those profits in country, that's having those profits be exported. And so the benefits of that resource, the benefits of that production that is happening in wherever, is getting taken away from the people who are doing the work for it.
Exactly. It's more of who owns the means of production at that point. It's where the colonial nations own like the steel mills, the capital to make, like in Hawaii would be the sugar plantations, the sugar mills and things, where all the capital came from the United States, but Hawaii exported the raw product of sugar.
Yeah, and that's why it's great, Sam, that I have you with Shinji, because Cuba obviously has a long tie with sugar plantations as well, driven by American capitalist interests. So there's a lot of overlap there.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, sugar was the greatest import or export of Cuba, and it made it very dependent on the United States. That's why Cuba was basically a neo-colony for most of its republic, because it was so dependent on American trade with sugar for its economic advancement.
Well, and going all the way back across the Caribbean, going back to the earliest days of European colonialism in the Caribbean, as soon as the Spaniards and later the French, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Danish started to realize that there wasn't all of the gold and silver in the Caribbean that they had expected, or at least, not the amounts that they had expected. And they couldn't grow tobacco or cotton as well as they could in the American South, for instance. What was the resource that all of these Caribbean islands could produce that made the most money for them? And nearly uniformly, it was sugar. So you see that in Cuba, you see that in Martinique, you see that in the Dominican Republic, you see that all across the Caribbean.
And harvesting sugar is not an easy process. It is tiring, it is backbreaking, and in these humid, just really hot environments. In Hawaii, it's kind of different from the Caribbean. We have the trade winds, which kind of make it nicer, but it's still really hot, really humid, and you get cut up with the sugar cane. It's not a fun.
Yeah, it's very labor intensive. And not only that, but it's very seasonal. So workers, at least in Cuba, would have to work the periods of sugar and then depend on whatever they earned during the harvest season to survive for the rest of the year until the next harvest season, because there was no benefits whatsoever and they didn't own the land directly.
just like with cotton and tobacco in the southern United States, which are also very labor intensive. And in both regions, I don't know about Hawaii, but in both the Caribbean and the United States, you saw what was the best way to make a profit from these very labor intensive crops. Well, it was very often to use slaves. And so that's why, I mean, there's a reason that Jamaica and Haiti and Trinidad are mostly black countries, even though they're not in Africa. And it's because so many slaves were imported to those islands, and also to Cuba, to the Dominican Republic, to every other island there, that they've become a major part or a majority of the population.
Yeah, and in Hawaii, we have a third of our population is from Asia, and brought over specifically for that reason. They became indentured servants to the sugar-owning oligarchs.
Actually,
go ahead, Shinji, sorry.
I was just saying, it's actually really interesting because out of all the Latin American countries, or countries in the Americas in general, Cuba was actually the second to last country to abolish slavery. All the way until 1886, Cuba still had slavery under the Spanish. Only Brazil had slavery longer than Cuba. And that was only to keep up the sugar plantations, mostly in the tobacco plantations.
I wasn't even aware of that. I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, Cuba was second to last country to abolish slavery, even though native Cubans fought to end slavery, but the Spanish colonials did not stop it.
When I learned recently that in another parallel with the American South, Cuba also maintained a policy of segregation for a long time after slavery, up until the revolution.
Yes. They were not, a lot of blacks were not allowed to enter a lot of hotels. Yeah, they weren't allowed to enter certain parks. Like, for example, very famously, Santa Clara, which is like a major city in the center of Cuba, has a very lavish park. And until after the revolution, there was a huge fence that was surrounded this huge park that was segregated. So only whites get into the park.
Now, in this context, whites would be like any of the mestizo people of Cuba. Would that be right?
Yeah. It's not exactly like American like racial policy, because it's a lot more mixed. But yeah, usually like either mestizos
like de jure versus
Europeans,
de facto, right?
Exactly. Yes. Anyone, as long as you were white passing, it was okay.
Yeah, it is similar in the sense where like the racial roots are rooted in colonialism, like with Cuba and the United States, how they remain to this day. The segregationist policies and the racism that we still see is as a result of centuries of colonization. So where was I at? Oh, yeah, I wanted to talk about some of the most imperialistic regimes throughout history. Right off the bat, we have the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Mongolian Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Ottomans, the British Empire, the French, the Spanish Empire, the Japanese, and the American Empire.
I feel like we have to draw some dividing lines in that, because
fair point.
I feel like
they're not all the same.
Like comparing the Persian or Roman empires to the British or Spanish empires to the United States or the USSR, like those are three different types of empires, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
Empire of Antiquity is completely different than a colonial empire.
Mm-hmm. And like an Empire of Antiquity, the Romans, the Persians, the Macedonians, just by means of their technology, those were very much more hands-off empires. Like it was impossible to control, Spain, to control Spain's every movement from Rome with the technology they had at that time. And so like with some rough guidelines and, system of tributes and taxes, provinces of an empire were allowed much more freedom back then, whereas compared to the, I guess, peak imperialism of the Spanish, the British, the French empires in the age of exploration, they call it, and the age of imperialism.
Well, I think you could compare Rome actually pretty well to some aspects of the American empire, in which their major form of empire was cultural colonization, where they'd bring their cities, their technologies, their elites to these new places. They might not interfere too much with local government. They would build their own like palaces and cities and rule over these people.
Mm-hmm. It was much more about like, as long as you give us your taxes and don't rebel, you're allowed more of a free hand.
Yeah, and also in antiquity, like empires were more about controlling land and people and resources, because that's what made profits, was control of land, because there wasn't industry like how it is now. Exactly.
Yeah.
While colonial
agrarian
empires,
societies.
exactly. While colonial empires were more about expanding a market or expanding a new customer base that you could exploit for like cheaper materials, but sell it back at a higher price. It's not necessarily identical, but they're, they have their similarities.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is the birth of capitalism between the two.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, the third category there is the more modern ones, where you're not necessarily, just like Sam described earlier, you're not necessarily taking physical control over the land. You don't necessarily have your military there and your flag waving over their palace, but you have control of the resources, control of the money.
Exactly, yeah.
So let's talk about some of the main characteristics of imperialism. We have highly authoritarian, pretends to be shocked. That's news to everyone, right? Exploitation of another nation's resources, which we mentioned. The forced change of religion or government or both by another nation. When a new government diminishes a cultural practice, or if one nation exploits another to improve its economic growth.
One of the ones you brought up, which was the changing of religions and cultures and all that, that's actually really interesting, because not all empires actually subscribe to that. Like a lot of them, of course, have, because they want to assimilate, but a lot of them are perfectly fine. Like let's go as back far as like the Persians. The Persians were actually pretty lenient with allowing other cultures and religions and languages, as long as they were loyal to the central. It's hard to call it a central government because states didn't exist the same way as they do now. But you know what I'm saying? More or less a central authority to respect it. But they more or less accepted. Even all the way to colonial empires, they didn't really try to push too much their culture. They wanted some sort of elite to accept their culture, but the masses themselves, they weren't too interested.
Well, I think that depends on which colonial empires you're talking about, right? Like, so I just visited San Antonio and we went to the missions there, and they talked about how when the Spanish brought people in these missions, you get a new name, you get a new religion, you get a new way of life, you get a new identity, you become a Spaniard. Basically, they're trying to create, the Spanish were trying to make people into Spaniards, and that's why so much of Latin America is Catholic. It speaks Spanish. There are so many foods in common with Spain and etc. Whereas if you look at like the British Empire, like even within that empire, there's variation. You have like Canadians who have become much more compared to British people, or Americans or Australians. But then Indians, for instance, who were allowed much more to keep just, almost like that Roman situation of pay us your taxes and don't rebel and do what we say, but you can keep speaking your language, keep practicing your religion, and you're doing what you need to do as long as we get what we want out of you.
Yeah, of course.
I think this heavily ties into colonial America, because it's tied into manifest destiny, believing that this group is savage, that they're they don't believe in our religion, they don't practice the way that we do. So we're going to force our culture onto them. But I get what you're saying, Shinji, because it definitely doesn't apply to all of these imperialistic regimes.
Yeah, I feel like it's more of a more modern concept, because let's say, for example, the United States. That's a perfect example. It wasn't trying to be a traditional empire like a European style. It's trying to be more of influence. So it tried to sell its way of life, so it could seem much more friendly and much more, we're not really here to take you over. We're just here to help. We're
spreading democracy.
Exactly.
That depends on the time period of which the American Empire. Yeah, like during the spread westward, the phrase "save the man, kill the Indian" was basically trying to Christianize, the the excuse for bringing a bunch of native children into these reform schools, not reform schools. Forget the exact name. Yeah, I think so. But that was the motto: was save the man, kill the Indian. And even in Africa with the English Empire, would their excuse, not excuse, but they said their mission, the white man's burden, was to colonize and save the savages' souls, which brought a bunch of missionaries, especially here in the Pacific, like missionaries all over and from every denomination. There's a huge Mormon fucking church in the Pacific. And that is a direct line from colonization.
Yeah, true. But I guess another example, I guess, would be not everyone would technically consider them an empire. I personally do. But the Soviet Union did Russification of every territory it controlled. You know, pushed the Russian language, it pushed its culture, and it tried to extend like other cultures. Like, let's look at like Central Asia. Like a lot of them still speak Russian, and a lot of the recent years countries in Central Asia or former Soviet states have like tried to create their own identity. But during the Soviet times, they definitely Russified most things they could get their hands on.
Well, China did the same thing. You know, the Han Chinese, they came from an area around the Yellow River and gradually expanded into what's this massive country now that's 95% Han or whatever. And that's because over the course of thousands of years, whenever they would conquer another person, they would sinicize, and whenever they would conquer another place, another neighbor, they would sinicize it. And, you know, after a couple of generations, it would be a Mandarin-speaking Han part of China. They even interestingly had this what seems like a practice of sinicizing the people who conquered them. For instance, the Mongols conquered China, and after a generation, Kublai Khan was essentially a Chinese emperor of, you know, a Mongol that, for all intents and purposes, acted like a Han Chinese person. The Manchus also conquered China, and then, you know, after a couple of generations, were essentially Han, and now there are very few Manchus left, and very few people who speak Manchu, for instance. Which I think is interesting. I recently wrote a piece where I spoke to several people who had fought in Afghanistan, and they talked about how we were trying to export. They wouldn't have phrased it as, you know, exporting our culture, exporting our way of life, but we were trying to export our political institutions, our economic institutions, the way that we do things here. And so, I mean, you know, very often it can be things that I think the people doing it would look at it and say, hey, we're just doing this for their own benefit. We're bringing them democracy. Like you said, we're bringing them, you know, if you're someone who thinks that capitalism is a good thing, we're bringing them capitalism. We're bringing them economic prosperity. And so,
yeah, I mean, I think that's how they justify it, right? They're just like, we're making people's lives better.
It's the white man's burden.
Yeah.
You know, as messed up as it is, I always find it kind of funny what ancient China would call like basically taking over another culture and like making it Chinese. They would call it like harmonizing, which was like always hilarious to me. They were like harmonizing a people and making them one with the Chinese. Like that was I always found that so like messed up but funny that they would come into a place and be like, we're just going to harmonize you. Now you're Chinese.
Yeah, that does sound pretty insidious.
Yeah,
like, it's a big club. It's fun.
We're not genociding your culture. We're just harmonizing it.
Wow, they have a long history of doublespeak.
Yeah, which is basically what modern China is doing now, where they just kind of go, we're not getting rid of the Uyghurs. We're just making them Chinese.
We're harmonizing them.
Yeah, we're just, you know, vocational schools.
Yeah, where you can't leave and we have you monitored 24/7.
So I was getting to social Darwinism. Social Darwinism ties into the early origins of American imperialism, which it's a sociological theory that sociocultural advance is the product of intergroup conflict and competition. And the socially elite classes, such as those containing the wealth and the power, the bourgeoisie, possess biological superiority in the struggle for existence. We still see that to this day, a large degree of social Darwinism.
Yeah, social Darwinism always seemed like a post hoc justification for what they are already doing. They are already spread out throughout the world, and then Darwin came along and basically blew open the world of biological evolution. And people go, well, you know what, that makes sense. We're the best, and so we have the right to take over everybody.
Well, that's exactly what it was. It was a justification for what they were already doing. And not only imperialism, but also at this time, you started to see the growth of Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller, and like the kind of people that, for perspective, for people who don't know who those are, they would be like the Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg of their day, that had so much more power, wealth than hundreds, thousands, millions times more than most of the people in the world. And so it's a justification for the social structures that already exist, and why actually that's a good thing. It makes me think of the reason that I say that white supremacy is a side effect of capitalism is because people came to the New World, and they, like we talked about these labor intensive crops earlier, they realized that the only way to make it, the best way to make a profit off of those was by using slaves. But they're good Christians, right? They want to go to heaven, and so they can't own slaves, and so they have to create this arbitrary racial hierarchy that says actually it's okay for me as a good Christian to go own slaves and still go to heaven.
Yeah, and the racial hierarchies are intrinsically tied into the manifest destiny concept too, right? Mm-hmm. The animosity towards Mexicans, Asians, and American Indians was closely tied into scientific theories, in air quotes, of racial hierarchies that justified the occupation and confiscation, of their territories. Just tripping over my words a little bit there. So yeah, they use this imperialistic mindset as a justification to expand the U.S. across the western frontier.
Well, that was before Darwin, wasn't it? Especially, I think, like the American project, Manifest Destiny was another post hoc justification for what we've been doing since, I think.
Yeah, we're talking the 1850s or something right now?
Yeah.
It started before Darwin, but it ended after Darwin.
Yeah, after Darwin, we had the eugenics movement, which was a whole different bag of beans.
Yeah, I think it all ramped up until World War II, when Germany showed us the logical extreme of what this thought process was.
Yeah, and Sam, have you read Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution?
A while ago.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I can remember.
That's supposed to be just a complete fucking destruction of social Darwinism.
Yeah, well, Darwin himself had a complete destruction of social Darwinism.
Yeah, he didn't believe in it. He thought it was a bastion of his theory.
Yeah. And yeah, mutual aid was more of a rigorous scientific way of going, no, social Darwinism is not how nature works. I mean, yes, evolution and not survival of the fittest, but survival of those that survive, Mm-hmm. And mutual aid is how you survive.
Well, I think that's a misunderstanding of the natural concept of survival of the fittest, is that people think, and you hear people say this now when they're talking about people taking ivermectin and not getting vaccinated and stuff or whatever. And they think that survival of the fittest means that like the smartest, the strongest get there. And sometimes it means that, but not necessarily, because all it actually means is that the people who are the most likely to, or not people, but I guess people, yes, but the animals that are the most likely to procreate are the ones who get to pass their genes on. And so even if you have a positive evolution, like that, that you get smarter, if that positive evolution doesn't make you more likely to have children, then it doesn't get passed on.
Yeah. And then obviously genocide and imperialism are extremely closely aligned, right? Like the imperial mindset and belief that a certain group of people is literally inferior or lesser than you. Like, because it strips away the humanization factor. And this is what we've been doing for thousands of years throughout history. People take a certain group of people and they're like, they're not as civilized as us. They don't practice the same culture as us. So it's okay if we just go in there and we change their religion, we change their system of government. We fucking genocide them. It's okay because they're not humans. They're not the same as us.
Yeah, actually, and I want to take back my statement of saying Germany showed us the logical extreme. We have already gone to the logical extreme in Africa and the Americas. Is it the only good Indian is a dead Indian?
Well, we don't even have to a little controversial, but you don't even have to go that far. Like Israel is doing it, like in Palestine, they do it constantly. Like it's still happening in everyday life. Like we have it going on. It's never really stopped. But going back to social Darwinism, it's really funny because it's still, even though it's been more or less denounced as a way of thinking, it's very prevalent still in a lot of arguments for capitalism.
Yeah.
Like you hear on every day, like people will be like, well, these people were just meant to be poor because they weren't able to get a job or what,
didn't work hard enough.
The great man theory.
Yeah, pick yourself up by the bootstrap. It's like, well, do you realize like the logical extreme of these is like social Darwinism? You just think these people are naturally incapable of doing better, which is just blatantly wrong. That's not how things work. But it's still haunting our world. All these ideas of superiority, and it's not even racial, just social class superiority. It's really damaging.
Have you ever heard of the weed and seed strategy from the late 80s, early 90s?
No, I haven't.
So in the late 80s, early 90s, we were starting to see the movement towards, the extremes of Reagan had deregulated the economy, right? Reagan had basically made it more free market, and making the economy more free market. Well, that leads eventually down the road to now. And we were starting to see all the problems that emerge not long after Reagan was the president, not long after he did that in the late 80s, early 90s. And one thing in particular was that you saw this huge amount of unrest in urban Black communities because they were seeing how economically they were not advancing the way that they ought to, given the state of the economy, how people were saying, hey, you have civil rights now, you can vote now, but they were not advancing equally to other groups. And the weed and seed strategy, which I think was coined by Vice President Dan Quayle, who was George H.W. Bush's vice president, was this idea that you'll send the police in and you'll weed the community, you'll pull out the bad people, and then help the good people. And that's how you'll build up these urban communities, is by, hey, pull out the bad people, feed the good people. And it's like, okay, so the preposition of that is that there are people who are some of these people are just evil, bad people, the drug dealers and the criminals.
They're lesser deserving.
Exactly. And some of them are good. And it's like, I wonder what put people into those positions of being your bad people.
I think it's just long-running cultural and racist concepts, They've just been around forever. Related but unrelated, I always find it really interesting that we never really talk about it in America in schools or anything, but we had a period in this country where we literally euthanized people, or not euthanized, we sterilized people, not euthanized, sterilized people that were unfit, or what was the word? Feeble-minded, which was so broad. They considered orphans feeble-minded because their parents didn't love them. It was so weird. And we did that all the way to the 80s, right?
Disabled people, or people who were in prison,
or just poor people. They considered poverty.
Poverty was feeble-mindedness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or women who were too cranky, they would consider them feeble-minded.
It doesn't surprise me. The Nazis learned from Jim Crow.
Well, that's not just Jim Crow. That was happening in California. That was happening in New York. That was happening in Illinois.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I'm just saying,
all the way
general, the Nazis
San Quentin prison was a big spot where that was happening.
Yeah, and we were doing all the way until like 1970 something, I think. I don't remember. I think it was 73. It was pretty recently. It didn't stop until relatively recently. And the Supreme Court said it was completely legal. But when it first started, they said, yeah, this is totally fine.
Mm-hmm. So you talked earlier about imperialism being authoritarian, Jordan. And I think, we're talking about all these like logical progressions. Mm-hmm. And this is another logical progression where if you want, imperialism and authoritarianism have to go together, because what is imperialism but like dominating a person or people who don't want to be dominated? If they want you there, if they want you if they want to be a part of your whatever, I don't know if you would still call it an empire, but if they want to be a part of it, that's not imperialism. Then that's just like, like voluntary association or whatever. But if it's imperialism, that means you're dominating people who don't want you there. And that has to be authoritarian, because if it's not authoritarian, well, they're gonna boot you out, aren't they? Mm-hmm. And if you're being authoritarian, you have to create these justifications. You have to say to yourself that actually this is the best thing to do. It's good to be authoritarian. And especially when you're coming from a place like Britain, that even going pretty far back would pride itself as being a democracy. To justify being so authoritarian to these people, they would have to say, oh, well, they're lesser. They're not deserving. They're not ready for democracy. They're not like, they can't handle democracy.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And there's like different layers to it, right? Like a country could have boots on the ground in another country where they're actively jacking resources and oppressing people, or they can do what we'll get to in a little bit and install a dictator in a country and then just have them do whatever they say in the home country. So there's different levels of imperialism, but yeah, it is all highly authoritarian in nature. I wanted to get back to something that we mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, because I think it's relevant in terms of building like a little bit of a background for the events in Cuba, which is the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, for our listeners that don't know, was a United States policy that opposed European colonialism in the Americas. And it argued that any intervention in the politics of the Americas by foreign powers, especially European powers, was a potentially hostile act against the United States. With the doctrine, America claimed that the Western Hemisphere was ours. And, any European involvement in the Americas would just be seen as a complete act of war, and our military would be involved. So we did that. Was that 1820s, 1830s?
I think it was the 1810s, 1820s.
Monroe was the fifth president.
So 1810s.
Okay. Yeah, like early 1800s, we established the Monroe Doctrine, which is just like, a giant middle finger to Europe. We're like, fuck you, Western Hemisphere's ours.
What's funny about that is like you could take that in two different ways, because you could take it the way that they did and say, okay, well, like it's ours, or you could treat that as okay, well, we're going to protect them from you coming and saying they're ours.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Like I feel like they tried to justify it as like a solidarity thing, like, oh, we're really actually saving you from European colonialism. But
isn't that just so American?
Aren't we so great? We're saving you from the bad guys, but now we are the only ones that could dominate you.
Yeah, and then that leads into years later, like 70 years later, we have the Spanish-American War. And there's a bunch of propaganda, obviously, surrounding that. Like every war has propaganda. And it was largely driven by an intense competition over two large newspaper-owning titans. You had William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. And basically, there was this concept called yellow journalism in the 1890s that arose, where they would have these massive headlines that would be like extremely catch-all, and like you think of clickbaity nowadays. And it was like that, but back then. And they were extremely propagandized. And back then, people just couldn't really like fact check things. So the prime source of information was from the newspaper. So they largely just believed things that came from, the state or corporations or whoever had influence on the paper.
I think that's a good metaphor. I've never heard them described as clickbaity. But I think that's a good way of putting it.
It was the original fake news.
It was, yeah, and I see a lot of overlap from back then and then now, and then we'll also have a conversation about how I think it relates to manufacturing consent. The Spanish-American War. I had some quotations here from Howard Zen's A People's History of the United States. So, same period, by the 1890s, we're talking. There had been much experience in overseas probes and interventions, and the ideology of expansion was widespread in the upper circles of military men, politicians, businessmen, and even among some of the leaders of the farmers' movements, who thought foreign markets would help them. Captain A.T. Mahan of the U.S. Navy, a popular propagandist for the expansion, greatly influenced President Theodore Roosevelt and other American leaders. And the countries with the biggest navies would inherit the earth, he said. And then Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, that's a great name, by the way. Anyone with the name Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge, sounds like a very rich guy, of Massachusetts, wrote in a magazine article, "In the interests of our commerce, we should build the Nicaragua Canal, and for the protection of that canal and for the sake of our commercial supremacy in the Pacific, we should control the Hawaiian Islands and maintain our influence in Samoa. And when the Nicaraguan Canal is built, the islands of Cuba will become a necessity. The great nations are rapidly absorbing for their future expansion and their present defense of all the waste places of the earth. It is a movement which makes for civilization and the advancement of the race. As one of the greatest nations of the world, the United States must not fall out of the line of march."
Talk about saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, they didn't do that at all back then. And then, in addition, there was a Washington Post editorial that was written on the eve of the Spanish-American War that says, quote, "A new consciousness seems to have come upon us, the consciousness of strength, and with it a new appetite, the yearning to show our strength, ambition, interest, land, hunger, pride, the mere joy of fighting, whatever it may be. We are animated by a new sensation. We are face to face with a strange destiny, the taste of the empires in the mouth of the people, even as the taste of blood in the jungle." Absolutely fucking psychotic.
You know what I wonder? So I think, like, you can see within the context of how, when people are writing and the political context, you can see why people would think we need to build an empire. If it's like you're looking at this from a perspective of what we need to do is we need to be more powerful than these other European countries. We need to be richer. We need to do all these things. And like the logical next step is like building an empire helps with that. And if you want to do that, you have to have this big navy, and like, you know, they're trying to look at things very logically.
Yeah, because I think that's right. Because most of human history, you think of an advanced civilization as one that has hard power, right? One that has a strong military. So I think you're right with that.
And I wonder how much of the American imperialist project, and I don't mean like I don't mean California as part of this particular imperialist project I'm talking about, but I'm talking about Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. That's a big one. I shouldn't forget them. I wonder how much of that particular imperialist project was driven by like insecurity, I guess, because Britain, France, they had these massive empires. And as coming out of the Civil War, America became a country that could compete in the world stage. They look at themselves and they say, hey, we don't have massive overseas empires like the French and the British and the Germans and the Dutch. We want to have these massive empires too. And even that it could seem like a threat. Like, oh, well, Britain has this massive empire. They have Canada, they have the Bahamas, they have Jamaica, like all these things right by us. Like if we have to get an empire to defend ourselves from the British, from the French, from the Germans. But yeah, I wonder how, like, if, you know, I don't think that people would have been so pressed to go after the Philippines and Cuba and Hawaii if it weren't for the fact that Britain already had India, which is, you know, how many Hawaiis is India worth?
Well, based on the geopolitics of the time, it feels more like it was a vanity project more than any particular threat. It was more, well, we have to assert ourselves on the global stage as a superpower. And the only way to be recognized as a superpower is having other territories, imperial territory. So I guess that's what we do. And America just kind of went down the path that well, we want to be the big boy on the table too. So I guess we're going to have to start conquering stuff. And they eventually got addicted. They went, wow, this is really fun. We like having all these little countries we could just control. And
I think commerce has more to do with it than feeling of inferiority. But certainly, in the Pacific at the time of dealing with Hawaii, there was Britain and France also gobbling up islands in the Pacific. But in terms of the Caribbean, much of from the literature had to deal with building a canal and protecting that canal, especially in Puerto Rico and Cuba.
Yeah,
their strategic influence of building a canal to connect East Coast and West Coast and their markets together had a huge impact on how we interacted with at least Central America. And when it comes to the Pacific, our access to the Chinese market had a huge impact on where we should get our harbors, specifically at Hawaii and Samoa.
The economic incentive was definitely top of the list. Like how you said, Guantanamo was so coveted for a long time because it was considered the gate to the Panama Canal. And controlling that meant that they had control over the Panama Canal.
Yeah, Sam, did you want to touch on the Roosevelt Corollary?
Well,
how it ties into the Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah, it's an extension to the Monroe Doctrine, which, if I were to sum it up, it's where we could gobble up any neo-colonies in Latin America. Let's see if I could, if I remember correctly, it's saying any foreign debts owed to countries in Latin America, United States will ensure that debt is paid. And so this gave justification for our invasion in Haiti, our invasion in the Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be debts to America, they owe money to America, or would that also be if they owe money to Britain or France?
Well, if they owed money to Britain or France, the United States would ensure that money would be paid so as to not get Europeans involved in the American continent as an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. But it was also just saying, these neo-colonies you have in the Americas, like Haiti, we're just going to take over their neocolonial status and be the masters.
Yeah, and another thing, too, that really pushed the imperial interests of the United States was the fact that the farms and factories within the country were producing so much stuff. Capitalists within the United States were like, hey, we need to pursue foreign markets. We're literally making too much stuff for Americans to consume. And several years before President William McKinley was elected president, he said straight up, we want a foreign market for our surplus of products. And then there was a Senator, Albert Beveridge of Indiana, and he took a more mask-off approach to this. He said, American factories are making more than the American people can use. American soil is producing more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours.
Well, that makes me think of what Marx said about the boom and bust cycle of capitalism, how the capitalists eventually will produce so much that it becomes unprofitable for them, and the boom turns into a bust. And that seems like just kind of delaying that a little bit.
Yeah, imperialism is just trying to delay or expand the market internationally.
Yeah, this is all Lenin explained.
I was going to ask you guys about if you agreed with Lenin's consensus that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism.
I think it is. I agree with him.
It's a high stage of capitalism. I don't want to put an end point to any system. We don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the final step because, from his point of view,
highest.
Yeah, but I think it's definitely up there. Imperialism is definitely up there.
Definitely a form,
interesting.
especially modern, a form of capitalism.
It's never gone
I just
away.
had the thought, what if the highest form of capitalism is like space imperialism?
That is the future. That is inevitable. As long as capitalism exists, that's the inevitability.
Yeah, for sure. And we're already seeing that with the vanity projects up into space with Bezos.
I love how
I
that
read
already.
a book.
Oh, go ahead.
I read a book recently called Fully Automated Luxury Communism by Aaron Bastani, who's British. And he basically, the premise of his book is that we have the technology that we're moving very quickly towards a post-scarcity world, but it will only be post-scarcity. It can't be post-scarcity under capitalism. He gives the example of asteroid mining and just the near Earth asteroids. So I don't know how much you know about like solar geography, but so there's what's called the Kuiper Belt, which is between Mars and Jupiter, where most of the asteroids in the solar system are.
The asteroid belt. The Kuiper Belt's way out there, past Pluto.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. The asteroid belt then. And so the asteroids inside of that, like that are not a part of that, but closer to the sun than that, are called the near Earth asteroids. And he was talking about how the near Earth asteroids alone have enough minerals in them that if you sold it all at current prices, you could get every single person on Earth like $100 billion. The problem with that is that if you did, like it wouldn't be worth that much money because the prices of them would crash. Now, without capitalism, what does that mean? That means, all these minerals are free forever. It's what that means. But with capitalism, what will happen is that they'll create an artificial scarcity, that they'll like do something like the example he gave was bring an asteroid in close into Earth orbit, mine it and sell it at just low enough prices that on Earth mines can't compete, and then like maintain this amount of scarcity so you can still make a profit.
Yeah, they're going to do basically more or less, of course, less complicated than what they do with oil, where, they'll start pumping more, they'll pump less just to mess with the price. Yeah, exactly. It's all like artificial. There's enough, for it to not be so expensive. It's just artificially inflated.
Have any of you seen The Expanse?
Yes.
What's up?
Yeah, that is a show, a sci-fi space odyssey about like not super far into the future, but it's only we've colonized Mars, the belt, and a little bit past that. And the belt basically is full of basically proletariat, just working class people spending their whole lives in shitty conditions, totally at the whims of the rich and the bourgeoisie of the time. It's a really great show. I'd highly recommend it. Speaking of like space capitalism.
It is really good.
Damn, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, for real.
I wanted to ask you guys, how do you see the concept of American imperialism related to American exceptionalism?
Well, I think that's go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's interlinked. Like American exceptionalism is the idea that we alone can help everyone else be as good as us.
We are a force of good in the world.
Yeah,
exactly.
We might be an empire, but we're a good empire.
We're the good one. We're the exception.
Yeah.
Well, you remember what I talked about earlier about these, that I talked to these soldiers who talked about how in Afghanistan they thought their mission was to bring democracy and bring prosperity and bring the free market and bring commerce and all of these things that, they sell it as a good thing. They sell it as we're doing a good.
I mean, we even do it to our own military. We right after 9/11, we told our own troops that Iraq was responsible for 9/11.
Yeah, in order to do most terrible things, you need to think you're doing good.
Well, no one ever thinks they're the bad guy, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Hitler
that's where
thought he was the good guy.
Yeah,
I know I'm evil and I don't care.
I guess Ted
so we
Bundy
need these justifications.
I think you're right. I think they're required.
Yeah.
Yeah, like and not only does no one ever think they're the bad guy, no one ever like gains political power if other people think they're the bad guy, if like the people that they need, if your base, if your whatever it is, your voter bloc or the oligarchy that you need, or whatever political base that you need to gain power, you need some level of support among other people. And if those people think you're the bad guy, you'll never get that power.
Yeah, it's weird. You never have like this
It's
weird. You never have like this moment of self-reflection from dictators where they're like, hey, you know what? I'm kind of out of line right now.
Are we the baddies?
I need to chill, bro.
I'm just saying, it's a skull.
That would be a really, just imagine being that person and having that moment. That would crush you. Like knowing that you're the bad guy, it's game over.
Oh my God, I know. Just
listen to the New York Times' podcast, The Daily. Their episode from today is kind of exactly what you just described, Shinji.
Oh, yes, FBI. I know what you're talking about. The FBI agent.
Yeah.
It's like Donald Trump taking mushrooms.
But he realized he was the baddie. He literally said it in the podcast. He was like, I work for an evil group. Like, I'm evil.
At the beginning of the podcast, he's talking about his upbringing. He's like, yeah, I grew up as like a Berkeley hippie, like, walking barefoot to People's Park. My mother was an Ethiopian immigrant, and like my uncle was an officer in the Black Panthers. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, how did you end up as an FBI counterterrorist agent?
Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah, that's good. I would recommend that.
Okay, my next topic that I wanted to get to, you guys, is Cuban Independence. The first one, that is the American acquisition of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So in the last few days of 1898, there was a big sense of euphoria over the island of Cuba. The country had been at war for the last 30 years. And then earlier in the summer, there were American troops that stepped foot on the island to assist Cubans in overthrowing the hated Spain, which had occupied the island for the last 300 years. And so with the aid of the American military, the final blow was ultimately delivered, and Cubans and Americans had plans to organize a giant celebration on the island. And so there were leaders of revolutionary patriotic committees, as they were called, in Havana that planned a full week of festivities that began on New Year's Day of 1899. So there were balls, boat races, fireworks, public speeches, and then at the end of it, there was a giant dinner that celebrated the victorious rebel commanders. And all of this was all well and good, but, America does what it does, and it stepped in and was like, psych. The newly named American military governor of Cuba, General John Brooke, made an announcement. He forbade the entire program. He canceled the parade of Cuban soldiers and said that anybody who tried to enter Havana would be turned away. And then in addition, the general declared that the United States also did not recognize the rebel army and wished it to immediately disband. Not surprisingly, this really pissed off Cubans, especially the thousands who fought so long and tenaciously for independence, and only to see the United States just snatch it away from them, which independence was their grand prize. As years passed, they and their descendants would watch in mounting frustration as the island would be increasingly taken away from them and put into the hands of the United States. The United States employed several strategies, including imposition of tyrants to assert complete control over Cuba. And Cubans were among the first people to feel the effect of profound changes that reshaped the American psyche at the end of the 19th century. This was a moment with remarkable suddenness, as historians describe. Americans ceased to be satisfied with holding territory on the North American mainland. They became consumed with the grand new idea that of a United States whose influence extended around the world. In the words of the historian Louis Perez, 1898 was a watershed year, a moment in which outcomes were both defining and decisive, at once an end and a beginning, that special conjuncture of historical circumstances that often serves to delineate one historical epoch from another. Ultimately, the United States would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate foreign policy, and give itself the right to completely control foreign affairs in Cuba.
America has always had an eye on Cuba. They always considered it like a inevitability that it would eventually be part of the United States. Mm-hmm. Actually, there's a quote from 1820s. Later in life, Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Monroe, actually, a quote which said, let me find it. The most interesting, this was him speaking about Cuba, the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states. They always considered Cuba an inevitability to become a state or to be annexed. Even they attempted multiple times to purchase Cuba from the Spanish. In the late 19th century, they offered Spain multiple times. They're like, hey, we're willing to buy Cuba from you. And Spain was, Cuba was the last bastion of their empire. They weren't going to sell it. And it was a cash cow. So they weren't going to do that.
Right.
So, but not only that, Cuba, went through two major independence movements. It went through the 10 Years' War, which was the first independence movement, which was ultimately a standstill. Like neither the Spanish or the Cuban rebels were able to succeed. Ultimately, it was a Spanish victory, but it was undecisive. Like no one really won. And for around 10 years, nothing really happened. And then the Second War of Independence, and same thing, standstill. And right at the end, America came in because of the Maine incident, and they just, in like 3 weeks, wiped out the Spanish. And, the Cubans always had, they kind of saw America like a double-edged sword. Like, yes, they're helping us gain our independence, but at the same time, we know that they're bad business. Like, they're not really here for us. There had always been annexationists, which are Cubans who wanted to become part of the United States, but they were always the minority. Most Cubans wanted independence.
Was it kind of like how the Soviets viewed the Americans at the end of World War II? Like, you guys helped us defeat the war, but we overall see you as an enemy.
No, they didn't. Cuba has never, believe it or not, and Cubans have never viewed the United States, at least the people of the United States, negatively, but they viewed the United States as like a Jose Marti, which is like the Cuban founding father. He's like all of the American founding fathers put into one for Cubans, right? He lived in the United States for a long time, and he said, I lived in the belly of the beast. Like, so he knew, the Cubans knew that America was this empire that was hungry to expand, but they also saw like the positives of being friends with the United States. They could help them gain, independence, greater economic ties and all that. But they were afraid of what inevitably happened, which was American domination. And
they saw the writing on the wall.
Exactly. And a lot of rebel leaders wanted to continue the fight against the American occupation, but obviously they knew it was futile. There was no way they were ever going to beat the Americans, and they were tired of fighting. But I was going to say, when you were talking about when they disbanded all these events right after the independence, there's a really famous event that happened in Santiago, which is the eastern city, the largest city, and the second largest city in Cuba. And where the general of the rebels, the Cuban rebels, came to the American general, I can't remember his name, and they were like, "We're going to march. They're going to have the peace deal with the Spanish. The Spanish were going to give the formal surrender to the Americans." And the Cuban rebels said, "Well, we want to parade with the Americans. We both won," and he denied the Cuban general and his troops to be anywhere near. They weren't allowed in the city for the handing over from the Spanish. And they didn't raise a Cuban flag. They raised an American flag in Santiago. And they told the Cubans that the reason they didn't want them there was because they were mostly made up of blacks, and they were unruly, and they were going to make a mess of things. They weren't sophisticated enough to preside over such an important event. That's what they told the Cuban rebels, in my own words. Basically, yeah. They saw America's view of Cuba at the time was like the white man's burden. It's this mixed race, like dirty people. They're not ready for like statesmanship. They need the guiding hand of the United States. And then maybe one day we might even like annex them, even though they had made a law which said they couldn't annex Cuba. But their plan was always to bypass that and try to annex Cuba. But they realized Cuba really was not going to let that happen. So eventually they just settled for the Platt Amendment, which is an amendment that basically gives the United States the ability to intervene in Cuban affairs militarily anytime they wanted. So if they thought something bad was going in Cuba, they could send the military to Cuba. No questions asked.
Sounds like good old Uncle Sam, huh?
Was this the same one that was the amendment that said that they weren't going to annex Cuba, or were those two different amendments?
No, that amendment is, I can't remember what it's called. That one was signed in the United States. It was like a law which said that Cuba would not be annexed into the United States. And the only reason they signed that into law, by the way, was because the senator who did it had large sugar plantations in the United States, and he didn't want to lose out on his profits by making Cuba a state. So that was the main.
You mentioned something like that to me, Ian?
Yeah, it was the Hawaiian sugar interest. Actually, it was these wealthy people in America who had holdings in Hawaiian sugar and didn't want Cuban sugar competing with them.
Yes, I think it was actually he had some plantations in Hawaii and he didn't want them to lose out to Cuban sugar. Yeah. But so then instead, the United States imposed the Platt Amendment into the Cuban Constitution. It was actually an article in the Cuban Constitution, which basically said that the United States, in case of crisis, could intervene in Cuba militarily. And actually it happened multiple times. There was multiple American occupations of Cuba. I think there was three occupations of Cuba until the Platt Amendment was removed in 1932 or 33. Yeah. And so, yeah, the United States basically, Cuba was no sovereign country can just allow another. So Cuba, that's why I always say Cuba was never really a sovereign country until basically after the revolution.
Jordan, question for you.
Yep. Sorry, what were you going to say, Ian?
Oh, yeah, programming question for you. So I know you had more you wanted to talk about imperialism, and then you also wanted to talk about the role of the military under socialism. And we got about like 42 minutes left, or it's been like an hour and 18 minutes.
I already know we're going to have to do a part 2.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sitting here like wondering if we are going to be able to get to both of those.
It's a huge topic.
Yeah.
We can go another 30 minutes if that's good with you guys, and then we can just plan a part 2.
Okay.
So let's finish the imperialism part now.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I have a quote here from Louis Perez from Cuba and the United States, The Ties of Singular Intimacy from 1990. He writes here, following the United States war with Spain, which ended in 1898, Cuban property owners reeled from debt and American businessmen interested in investment possibilities flocked to the island. American occupation enhanced business opportunities, and in 1899, R.B. Hawley organized the Cuban American Sugar Company and acquired both extensive tracts of land, in total 77,000 acres, and important sugar mills in the Matanzas? Okay. Pinar del Rio and Puerto Padre regions. Along with other American-owned companies, the Cuban American Sugar Company not only generated tremendous wealth for its investors, but promoted the development of American enclaves, which were usually in towns surrounding sugar mills. These areas grew into privileged neighborhoods inhabited by American technicians, chemists, agronomists. So here we have just American corporations, specifically American sugar companies, going into Cuba and actively making income inequality much worse for the Cuban people.
Well, if you don't mind, like all the way up to, I'm going to use statistics all the way up to 1959.
Yeah, that's fine.
But Cuba, 40% of its sugar plantations were owned by foreign landholders, either corporations or individuals. Imagine if 40% of your largest export was owned by another country. Also, 100% of Cuban utilities was owned by American corporations or American subsidiaries in Cuba. I think it was 70% of the railways were controlled by the United States. So, I think...
What years are we talking about?
All the way up to 1959, right to the end of the revolution. And to, I guess, the victory of the revolution. So all the telephones, all the water, all the electricity, all that was owned by American corporations. Almost all the trains were either run by subsidiaries or directly by United States corporations. A lot of the sugar and tobacco, I think 40% in total, was owned by Americans, individuals, or corporations. And there was like up to 2 million acres in total owned by foreigners in Cuba. So in total, yeah, Cuba was incredibly dependent on the United States.
Yeah, Shinji, also to add on that, in the early 1900s, there was a series of military involvements in Cuba from the U.S. military. And oftentimes when Americans think of like imperialism in Cuba, they typically just think of the revolutionary period in the 1950s. But the fact of the matter is that this period of imperialism in the early 1900s did leave a lasting emotional scar on the Cuban people.
Oh, yeah. As I said, Cuba had multiple American occupations where they directly controlled Cuba. They put an American governor of Cuba with American troops on the ground. Let me see. I think there was 3 occupations. Yes, there was 3. There was the original occupation right after the independence from 1898 to 1902. Then there was another one from 1906 to 1909, and then another one from 1917 to 1922.
Wow, that's longer than I expected.
Yeah, all those occupations, there was no president, there was nothing. They were directly controlled by an American governor placed by the President of the United States. Actually, even though the Platt Amendment was eventually removed, which all those interventions were allowed because of the Platt Amendment, it was a well-known fact that the most important person in Cuba was not the president of Cuba. It was the American ambassador. Anything that wanted to get done in Cuba had to go first to the president and then the ambassador to the United States.
When was the Platt Amendment removed?
I think in 1934, 33.
33 was the first Cuban Revolution.
Yes, the Cuban Revolution of 1933, they were able to get rid of the Platt Amendment. Because there was Cuba... it's always funny. Cuba, for a republic that started in 1902, had 2 dictators and two revolutions until 1959.
Whoa! It
had the first dictator against Machado, which was basically like Batista, and then Batista in 1952. Yeah, 1952.
So as you're describing the amount of economic control over the railroads and the utilities and the sugar and all of that, that gets me to thinking whether we're seeing the same thing happen in Africa right now, not with American control, but with Chinese corporations and Chinese banks and all of that controlling railroads and mines and everything. And having, I don't know exactly what the percentages are, but getting towards building, like it's seeming to be on the road to building that kind of economic control that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's basically, it's neocolonialism. They're not directly controlling the territory, but they're fundamentally controlling all the capital that's capable of controlling the country. Like if you can't function a state, you fundamentally control that country. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Because that Cuba, that's why I always say, like, what sovereign country can honestly function when 100% of your utilities are owned by a foreign power? Like, that's impossible.
Doesn't China own the utilities in the Philippines now?
I think they actually own the utilities in like a bunch of countries. In like Africa, they control the trains that they've been building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I remember something about the water or the electricity or something getting bought by a Chinese corporation. And even Australia, a lot of stuff in Australia is owned by Chinese banks and Chinese corporations.
1940 was a giant year in Cuba. That was the year that the Constitution of Cuba was implemented. That was during the presidency of Federico Laredo Bru. And that took effect on the 10th of October of that year, 1940. This document was actually largely inspired by the egalitarian ideas that were suggested in the 1933 Cuban Revolution. And at the time that it was written, it was considered one of the most progressive constitutions. Inside the Constitution, it called for land reform, public education, a minimum wage, and several other social programs. And also, when conducting research for this episode, I learned that the 1933 Cuban Revolution was also called the Sergeants' Revolt because it was a military coup that were led by sergeants and enlisted men in the military. And the leader of that revolt was named Fulgenio Batista. This is where he became head of Cuban armed forces and began his very long influence on Cuban politics.
So was Batista an enlisted man?
Yes, he was a sergeant. He actually wasn't that high in rank. He was, I think, a map maker, I believe, in the military.
I pictured him as an officer.
He was actually a rags to riches. He was very poor when he was young. And he's actually one of the few people in Cuba who actually had like a large Native American he was majority Native American, which is very rare in Cuba. Yeah, he was Taino, like mostly Taino, which is super rare.
I mean, I guess while you're saying that, we should also be clear to people that he was also like torturing people left.
Oh, he was a brutal dictator. He was worse.
I'm not going to leave out any of that. Don't worry.
Oh, he was awful, especially when in his dictatorship from 52 to 59. Oh my God. It's estimated.
CIA puppet.
Yeah, it's estimated that he killed somewhere around 20,000 people in 7 years.
Yep.
Yeah, which is actually higher, believe it or not. It's higher than the highest estimate by the Black Book of Communism for Fidel Castro in his entire reign. Fidel Castro is suspected to have killed, in the Black Book of Communism, which take that with a very big, grain of salt, said that Fidel killed 20,000 people from 1959 till he retired in 2008. So what does that tell you? That Batista was really pumping out them kills. He was not playing around.
Right. And when Castro came into power, he let people leave too. It's not like he forced everybody to stay in Cuba. He was like, fine. You're not with the revolution. Get the fuck out. Actually,
the revolution was very popular in the beginning stages. Actually, it was very popular for a long time. But to go back to the 1940 Constitution, I've always been a very big fan of that Constitution because it was very progressive. And a lot of the ideas of the Cuban Revolution actually were inspired by that Constitution. Actually, Fidel, in his Manifesto of the Sierra Maestra, which is like his big manifesto of the revolution, said that his primary goal was to reinstitute the 1940 Constitution and implement all the reforms that were never able to be done. Because even though the Constitution was implemented, none of the actual reforms were ever really done. It was just the document was legal, but the land reform, any of that, none of that really happened.
But didn't come out as a communist until a few years after he took power, right?
62.
Yeah, he was very, how should I say this?
Skittish.
He was intentional about not wanting to call himself a communist or a socialist.
Yeah, he didn't want to cause animosity with the bigger power to the north.
Yeah, he was worried about, exactly. He was worried about getting cooed by America.
So is he just framing himself as like a social democrat, kind of like Bernie kind of guy?
Well, by every metric, Fidel himself said that he was always a communist, but I find that very hard to believe based on all the other evidence. He said that about himself, and he said it later in life, which of course he would want to say. But if you look at every other document or anything else you could read about him at the time, he never really had his brother Raul was always a communist, but he was always more of like a Cuban nationalist to like a left, like a social democrat or liberal.
Che was always a communist.
Yeah, Che was always a communist, but Fidel himself was never really fully sold on communism. I personally believe that Fidel became a communist either because of the actions that came after the revolutions or to he came out as a communist, even though he wasn't necessarily one to gain favor of the Soviet Union, and then eventually became one.
That's what I was just going to ask.
Yeah, but I don't think he was a communist. By all metrics, he was not a communist. Like, actually, the CIA infiltrated the 26th of July movement in the Sierra Maestra, and they did a report on him. And the report they got back was that the most they could find on him was that he was probably a Cuban left-wing nationalist. Like not even a far left-wing, like a social democrat at most.
I know Cuba at this moment is controlled by the Communist Party of Cuba. So at what point did that become the case? Like when did Cuba, not when did Fidel come out as a communist, but when did Cuba become officially a communist or a socialist nation?
When he outed himself as a communist is when he declared Cuba a Marxist-Leninist state. I think it was in 1962. So, to rewind a little bit, during the Cuban Revolution, he did not openly ever ally himself with the Cuban Communist Party because they were actually a really powerful force in Cuba in politics before all of this. But not during Batista years, but before that. And he never openly allied himself, even though he did ally himself, but not officially with the Cuban Communist Party until the very end of the revolution, where it was basically inevitable, their victory. But even then, he kept an arm's length because he didn't want America to think he was an open communist. But after he takes power, Fidel is officially not the president of Cuba. He's technically only the leader of the armed forces, the revolutionary armed forces. He puts instead basically a puppet to become the president, which I got to look up his name. But he puts up this guy who was a lawyer, I believe, as the president of Cuba. And he had no power whatsoever. But Fidel during that time...
Was it Socaris?
I got to find his name. He didn't last very long because because I have here in my notes that in 1952 there was a president that was defeated in a military coup, and the then president of Cuba was Carlos Prio Socaris. Oh, okay. So during the Cuban, well, that's before the revolution. Carlos Prio was the last elected president of Cuba. He was the last president elected in the republic. And then there was a coup against him in 1952 by Batista, which overthrew Prio. But then Fidel came to power in the revolution triumphed in 1959. And Fidel officially did not become the president. He instead put a man called, there he is. His name was El Salvador Dorticos. I always forget his name. He had such a weird name. But that guy, he puts him as president for a little while he tries to do reforms in Cuba. Mm-hmm. They're trying to look pretty moderate to the United States and to everybody else. While they're working on this really big reform called the Cuban Agrarian Reform Act, which was probably the most important aspect of the revolution, which was basically going to break up all the large land holdings. No longer can foreigners own land, like the plantations in Cuba for sugar. The land would be given to the peasantry, whatever. That's what the Agrarian Reform Act. As time passed on, they got rid of that president because he was a lot more moderate and he wasn't cooperating anymore. And then Fidel put somebody else in power and he became the prime minister of Cuba. And that's where he basically just ran the country, until. So, but go ahead.
I was gonna say I found out that Batista. So he served one term in Cuba from 1940 to 1944 until coming back for the coup in 1952. But he moved to Florida after he was president. Did he always have an extremely close relationship with the U.S. government?
Not at the beginning, but right after he became president, yes. Not when he was a sergeant, of course, but when he became president, he did have a close relationship, but it wasn't as close as when he became a dictator.
Gotcha.
Because when he was president, he was democratically elected in 1940. Mm-hmm. And after he stopped because the Cuban Constitution only allowed one consecutive term.
Right.
He retired to Daytona in Florida. And then he came back and ran for president in 1952. He was going to run for president, and he realized he wasn't going to win the election. So that's why he did a coup.
Okay. Topic number 4, I wanted to talk about the second part of the Cuban Revolution. So after Batista regained power, like we said, he was completely backed by the U.S. government. It was a puppet, to which he immediately suspended the Constitution of 1940 and several key civil liberties that were contained inside that. Most importantly, the right to strike. After doing this, like every corrupt dictator likes to do, he aligned himself with Cuba's wealthiest landowning class, which were sugarcane plantation owners. And
this Batista we're talking about?
Yeah, Batista.
Yeah.
Okay.
The separation of wealth was immense, and Batista actively made it much worse, like I said earlier. American corporations completely dominated Cuba's main economic resource. And to add on some more layers of corruption to that, Batista was also heavily aligned with the American mafia, who, just like they did in Las Vegas, built up casinos and hotels and introduced rampant prostitution within 1950s Havana. So basically, I discovered that Shinji, was it before or after? Like Havana was basically the original Las Vegas.
Yes, Havana was the Las Vegas and Miami put together of its time. Miami was a small town because everyone went to Havana. Like all the big hotels, the fancy ones from the 50s that are still around, were run by the mafia. Meyer Lansky, who was one of the largest mafia bosses, controlled the Tropicana. They had control of the Hotel Nacional. They had now it's called the Cuba Libre or whatever, but that's what the hotel's called now. But they controlled all these hotels and the gambling, and they actually put mobsters into like cabinet positions in the government. So they were in bed with the Batista government. Batista completely allowed this, for kickbacks and all that. And Cuba basically became like a mobster state. Yeah,
there were even like U.S. senators and members of Congress and shit that would fly down into Havana.
Oh yeah,
would do all kinds of things that they would never imagine doing in the U.S.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of crazy stuff going on in 1950s Havana.
And then obviously all of this is happening. You have American capitalists and gangsters that are in high positions in the Cuban government, while the Cuban people are suffering from extremely high levels of unemployment, and there's water shortages all over the island.
Yeah. So during that time, it's really strange because the 50s is considered the high point of Cuba, like where for some people it was very good. It was a very good economic period. Basically, everyone who was upper middle class in Havana, basically everybody else was living in horrific shanty towns, outside of the major cities, of course. But they were living in shanty towns. Like there was very little work. Like I said, a lot of peasants worked in the sugar industry, and they only got paid basically once a year, which was during the sugar harvest. And they had to make that money that they earned during the sugar harvest last them the whole year.
Yeah, and that's very seasonal work, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So let's say once the season was over, whatever they got paid, you got to make that last until next year. And, that was incredibly rough for most people. So the revolution was inevitable, really. Not only because Batista was so incredibly corrupt, but the Cuban society was, for a very long time, like every president of Cuba stole an incredible amount of money from the treasury.
Yeah, and I think that's super ironic because even to this day, you'll talk to ignorant Americans and they'll say, oh, Cuba, that's an island that's full of corruption. But a lot of that corruption is driven by American capitalists and our mafia.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I don't want to because right now we're not talking about the revolution, but even Cuba after the revolution wasn't actually trying to do, they weren't trying to be radical, I guess, from the point of view of the United States, but none of the reforms that were being done were particularly radical from like a regular sort of position. They were just things to help Cubans not starve to death.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like the Agrarian Reform Law, which I said was like the most consequential reform in the early days of the revolution, was actually less radical than the agrarian reforms the United States implemented in Japan when they occupied Japan post-war.
Really?
Yeah. Because Japan was still basically semi-feudal in the countrysides. And the United States broke all that. Like they destroyed all those major landholdings and gave it back to Japanese peasants. Which is basically
in the first few years, they could let a lot of communists out of jail and did a bunch of land reform, approved labor unions.
Yeah.
And you understand, Shinji, it's okay when we do it.
Yeah, exactly. When the United States does it in their interest. But Cuba,
the Cold War, and then they all rolled that back.
Well, but by all extents, Cuba was basically pushed into the arms of the Soviet Union. Cuba did everything in its power to
because of the U.S.
Yeah, to try to have good relations. I think post-revolutionary Cuba was never going to have the same relations as pre-revolutionary Cuba, but they were going to have amicable relations. But the United States just wouldn't have any of it. You know, if you don't mind me like getting into the embargo real quick.
No, that's fine because we're going to do a part 2 anyway, so we don't really have to worry about time.
Well, the embargo only came about after the Agrarian Reform Law because one of the major, let's say, aspects of the Agrarian Reform Law was that no longer could Americans or foreigners own sugar plantations, which, in my opinion, is good. I don't think foreign domination of like your biggest industry is a good thing.
No, that's imperialism.
Yeah, so Fidel's trying to avoid imperialism by giving it back to Cubans, and they made it look. This isn't even that radical. When I tell you this, it's not going to sound that radical. They made it so landowners could no longer own more than 1,000 acres of land. Wow. So anything bigger than that was broken up and given to peasants. Anything
not exactly the Mao position.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Can you give us some perspective? Like, how much is 1,000 acres? Because, like, I'm not a farm guy. I don't have like a good reference point for what an acre is. So, like, give us some perspective of how much that is.
To miles, I guess it's like 1.5 miles.
Like football fields. Like, how many football fields would that be?
I'd have to look that up.
So it's about 757 football fields.
Yeah, that's a good piece of land.
Yeah, so they still allowed that. Anything larger than that, they would confiscate and break up and give to the peasants. So it's not really that radical. And the Cuban government, this is Fidel, I'm not talking about, offered to compensate for the land that was being redistributed in 20-year bonds at previous land value from the Batista era. This is how much they're willing to accommodate for the land redistribution. But but Americans, American business owners and American politicians were not happy with losing any land whatsoever. And also they confiscated a lot of property, like actual homes that were bought illegally or through shady practices in previous administrations, which a lot of people go, well, you're just taking people's homes away, but how were those homes acquired? You know, there were most of these homes that they took were from like millionaires who gave kickbacks to presidents and stuff in former administrations. They weren't just taking your like a family home. They were taking away like mansions and stuff. Okay?
This is like people's like second and third homes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so they did that, but they were angry about it. So American and British, but mostly American oil refineries, which were the only ones in Cuba, and all plants, like power plants in Cuba, were either coal or oil power plants. So these oil refineries refused. First, the United States cut selling oil to Cuba first. So then Cuba started buying oil from the Soviet Union because they were the only country willing to sell Cuba oil. So once Cuba bought the oil, this is legal. You're a country. You're allowed to do whatever you want, buy from whoever you want. They bought oil from the Soviet Union. And once it came to Cuba, the oil refineries refused to refine the oil because it was Soviet oil.
What?
And their demands to the Cuban government was either you step down, return the land, or we're not going to refine your oil, which basically means either you give up power or we're going to shut down your country. So Fidel had no other option but to nationalize the oil refineries.
I was just going to say, I can think of a third option.
And basically, that's what caused the American embargo when they nationalized the oil refineries.
Holy cow.
Yeah, it's completely like American aggression. Like Cuba was doing everything within the bounds of a sovereign country. They weren't doing anything like, oh my God. Not only that, another thing was, I don't personally agree with it, but another major reason that the U.S. said that they imposed the embargo was that there was public executions of former Batista-like collaborators, but I'm not talking about like politicians. I'm talking about like secret police or generals and stuff, like bad people. They were doing like public executions and firing squads. And the United States was like, oh my God, what are you doing? And they lost their mind, which I don't personally agree. I'm not in favor of capital punishment, but understandable in the circumstances. It's a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
These people are war criminals.
I think a lot of the people who would complain about that, like they don't complain about capital punishment when it's not in a socialist country.
Of course.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
And the people who were getting like executed, by the way, they were not like summarily executed. They were like put on trial. These were all trials. These people that they were executing were like war criminals. We didn't really talk about Batista, but during Batista, it was very common for people to get picked up off the side of the street, tortured all night, and then your dead body left at a park the next morning. This was a very common thing. So these people that were doing this, they were the war criminals that got tried in the revolutionary tribunals. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not necessarily condoning the act, but it's understandable giving the
I think that perspective is useful too, because like that gives a perspective of like what the political situation in Cuba was, and saying like, okay, well, even a public execution is like a step down from what was happening before.
Of course. And not only that, I don't know if you guys have ever heard, but Fidel did a speech or like a rally. In the early days of the revolution, he did this thing where he called it like direct democracy, where he would do a rally. And like these were crowds of like up to 1 million people in Havana. This is, 1/4 of the population almost showing up to the capital, you know what I'm saying? To these speeches. Mm-hmm. And one of these famous speeches, he talks about the executions. And he asks the Cuban people in the speech, do you want me to keep doing these executions? And overwhelmingly, they said, keep doing it. Like, keep shooting them. Like, it was like very popular with most people, what the Cuban government was doing at the time.
To give the pushback on that, like I would say, like, shouting at a crowd is not necessarily direct democracy. It's like, it's like a Twitter poll.
It's that's what Fidel called it. He said that was true democracy, like him just speaking to the crowds or whatever, which I don't necessarily agree with, but the things you justify, the things he justified.
All right, guys, we're at the 2-hour point, so let's wrap it up here. And Perfect. I'll just link up with all of you guys to do a part 2. Thank you so much for all of your time, dude. This was awesome.
Thank you, guys.
Of course, that was fun.
Thank you, guys.
Right. You guys have a great rest of your night.
You too.
Bye.